It seems as though this president, who promised to keep America out of forever wars, has entered into a conflict without a clear exit plan and is now raising the stakes in search of a solution. What worries you most about all this?
Well, Reverend, not only did he get into this without a clear exit plan, he got into this without a strategic goal that he was trying to achieve. If you go back to the end of February, the beginning of this conflict, he initially talked about regime change. He thought if we drop bombs for a few days, suddenly the Iranian regime in charge were going to go away and we'd have a new government. It's often people like Donald Trump who have no experience at this stuff that think air power is the solution to a problem. And then he talked about how, well, this is about nuclear weapons, about ballistic missiles, about getting rid of their Navy. At one point, we were told there was an imminent threat of something happening in the future. Like, what is imminent about the future? So he got into this without a strategic goal, without a plan, without a timeline, and then without an exit strategy. And he finds himself really painted himself into a corner. He doesn't know what he should do. And remember, we got here because he tore up President Obama's plan, the JCPOA, just tore it into pieces. And that kept the uranium enrichment at a very low level. So my biggest worry right now is just escalation. And we now have more dead Americans over the last couple days. He's starting to talking about ground troops and a possible invasion, Carg Island or something else. And that comes with consequences. And also, again, What is the strategic goal? Now,
the president has conspired with his allies in Republican congressional leadership to evade accountability through the War Powers Act. He has never gone to the American people to sell this war. In fact, as the situation has worsened last week, he delivered a primetime address about 2020 election conspiracies. His vice president, who negotiated the memorandum of understanding with the U.S. and Iran, had 3 hours to spend on the Joe Rogan podcast while that document was blowing up. As a Secretary of Defense, we'll get to that in a moment. But regardless of whether Americans support this war or not, they have a right to expect that it will be conducted with seriousness and sobriety by our leaders. Is that happening in your view? And what would you like to see them doing right now that they're not doing?
Well, it's not happening. And not only has he not sold this to the American people, he hasn't sold it to Congress. Congress has the responsibility of declaring war, not the president. Now, he can go and take some action. We've had War Powers Act votes on this. Hey, this president doesn't think strategically. And I've made this point before. We often talk about people playing checkers and people playing chess. This guy's moving a couple red Solo, those beer cups around on the table. Has no clue what he's doing and doesn't think strategically, doesn't think about the consequences. And going forward, I worry about what he's going to do next because he's often irrational. He doesn't spend a lot of time on the issues that he campaigned on either. I mean, he got us into this war when he said he was going to bring down costs for the American people. People are struggling. Right. Half of Americans are having a hard time affording food. Young people can't buy homes, can't afford rent. He kicked millions of people off of their health care coverage. They can't afford to go to a doctor. That's what he said he was going to focus on. And he starts a war with Iran, and then he spends an enormous amount of time on things like the reflecting pool and the ballroom and an arch. We've never seen this in our history, a president without priorities that matter to the American people.
Let's talk about Defense Secretary Hegseth, because he's been up to some curious things as we are in the thick of a war. I'll start with one of the most alarming stories. The New York Post reports that for the first time in more than a decade, no active duty female officers are likely to be promoted to admiral this year. We've heard other reports of officers of color being passed over systematically for promotions. And it comes as Hegseth is pushing for things like testosterone testing and replacement for troops, which we don't really know how they would impact women in the service. Does it feel like the secretary is trying to create an armed forces that only is hospitable to white men, and how would that impact us as a nation?
Well, right from the beginning of this administration, as soon as Pete Hegseth got the reins of the Department of Defense, started firing black people and women. They don't want black people and women in leadership positions. He's made that perfectly clear. And by the way, he doesn't even try to make an excuse. He doesn't talk about their competence for these jobs. We're losing multiple generations of leadership from the military, valued leadership. He fired CQ Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, because of the color of his skin. And this is going to have a long-term negative impact until this president decides to fire this guy. Pete Hegseth is by far the most incompetent person we have ever seen in this job, bar none. Nobody close. This guy, I mean, nothing, against the Saturday morning guy and people that, serve, cable news in the morning, but he did not have the background for this. And he had all kinds of personal problems. And now he spends his time dealing with things that don't matter, testosterone. I mean, we don't need more testosterone in the U.S. military. We need better leadership, and it starts with him.
Now, another Pentagon issue I was particularly interested to get your take on, as Secretary Hegseth's response to this low flyover of a crowd by a Blue Angel pilot at an air show in Pensacola Beach, Florida this week that went viral online. The Blue Angels say they are investigating what happened because of concerns about the safety of the maneuver. But Secretary Hegseth issuing a tweet that said, quote, the flyovers would continue until morale improves, end of quote. It's not the first time that the secretary has come out in defense of conduct that, at the very least, others would find concerning. As a former Navy pilot yourself, who has flown 39 combat missions, and a former astronaut who's been to space, what's your perspective on this?
So here's the thing. The Blue Angels are incredibly professional, as are the naval aviators. They take this job very seriously. And there are rules with regards to flying over people, a crowd like this on the beach. You generally don't fly below 500 feet. And when the Blue Angels perform an air show, they have a plan, and they do not put the public at risk. As I look at this, he was much lower than that. Now, I did see a statement from the pilot that did this that said, he did not intentionally fly over those individuals on the beach, overshot the turn, was lower in altitude. I think it requires an investigation. It should be done by the Blue Angels or the command, the Education Command, Naval Education and Training Command that controls the Blue Angels. And they need to, take some steps to make sure something like that doesn't happen again, because it can be dangerous. Pete Hegseth, though, is not a serious individual. And he says, we're going to continue these flyovers until morale improves. When you say something like that, you're sending a message to aviators throughout the military that the rules don't matter, that safety doesn't matter, that the public and public safety doesn't matter. And that's a mistake, because that could result in something happening in the future where people get hurt. And the responsibility that the military has to protecting the public, I mean, that comes before anything else.
Now, I want to ask you about new bipartisan legislation you are promoting aimed at recruiting more men to be teachers. Right now, only 23% of public school teachers are men. So increasing their ranks could help address the country's shortage of qualified educators at the same time as we provide new life opportunities for young men. Tell us about the proposal and how it would work.
Well, a couple things. One is getting more men into the classroom. When I was in elementary school, I had a male teacher in the 5th and 6th grade. something that young men often need, another male role model, somebody to look up to. Decades ago, that number was 35 to 40%. Now it's down around 25%. And continues to go down. So one piece of legislation is focused on getting more male teachers into the classroom, giving them the training, by the way, and paying them while they're being trained for these positions. And then another effort to get more male mentors. There's a long list of young men and boys that have signed up and they want some mentorship from men. And men, especially young men right now, are often very isolated. Sometimes they can't find a job, and they don't have that mentorship that they need. AmeriCorps is a good example of this, and we want to encourage mentorship programs like that. There's others. There's President Obama's mentorship program, My Brother's Keeper. There's Boys to Men, a program in Tucson, and we can take some steps to encourage them to reach out to more men and prioritize men into those programs.
Yeah, I personally know mentorship meant a lot to me. I want to ask you something. You were undecided, uncommitted when you were at National Action Network's convention. Let me ask you tonight, have you decided whether you're going to run for president in 2028?
Not made a decision yet. That's something that Gabby and I are working towards. I take these things very seriously. This is a incredibly challenging time for our country, and the needs of the American people are not being met. And I think this administration, unlike any others, is not addressing the right things. They're trying to help millionaires and billionaires with big tax cuts, ignoring hardworking people across this country who just can't afford their lives anymore, getting us into another war. The national security problems we have out there right now are significant. I think they're going to grow before we can, figure out a way to get this country back on the right trajectory. I'll make the decision at the appropriate time.
I didn't hear a no in that, so I'll leave.
No, I didn't say no.
All right. You didn't say no.
I did not say no.
I'll say it the third time. You didn't say no.
I did not say no.
All right.